If you have ever tried to trace your family tree and hit a mysterious brick wall around the year 1870 or 1890, you might think your ancestors simply vanished from the public records. But what if I told you that missing link was not a simple accident of history? What if that wall is the exact place where your bloodline was deliberately erased by the very institutions that claim to be saving children? Recent historical research from Johns Hopkins University has uncovered a terrifying truth about the American orphanage system in the 19th century. When we picture an orphanage, we imagine places of refuge for children who have lost everything, places of pure charity. But the data reveals a completely different reality. 90% of the children placed in American orphanages during this era had at least one living parent. Let me repeat that. 90% were not orphans at all. They were children who had families that were still intact, families that were simply poor, immigrant, or going through a temporary financial crisis. These children were not rescued. They were systematically harvested. The word orphan was nothing more than a convenient label, a legal fiction designed to strip lower-class parents of their custody rights. The institutions that opened their doors to struggling families, promising a temporary safe haven and a good education for their children, were actually operating as the front end of a massive government-backed human trafficking ring and child labor supply chain. This was a billion-dollar enterprise built entirely on the stolen identities and silenced voices of hundreds of thousands of children. Today we are going to look at the meticulous records that prove this charity was just a mask for the perfect corporate crime. Let us start by looking at the overcrowded streets of New York and Boston during the mid-19th century. This was an era of explosive urbanization and massive waves of immigration. Desperate families arrived looking for the American dream and instead found freezing tenements and brutal factory conditions. When a harsh winter hit, or a father lost his job, or a mother fell ill, these families faced an impossible choice. They needed temporary help just to keep their children alive, and freezing to death on the streets was a very real threat. And so they turned to the newly established orphan asylums. These institutions presented themselves as beacons of Christian charity. They promised desperate parents that their children would be fed, clothed, and educated until the family could get back on its feet. The parents believed they were making a responsible, heartbreaking choice to save their children. They fully intended to return and bring their children home when the crisis passed. But the orphanages had a very different plan, hidden in the fine print of the admission papers. When parents signed their children over to these institutions, they were often, unwittingly, signing away their legal rights entirely. The system was meticulously designed to prey on the illiterate and the desperate. The moment the ink dried on those documents, the child ceased to be a son or a daughter, and legally became the property of the institution. Therefore, the orphanage had the absolute power to decide the child's fate without ever consulting the biological parents again. You do not have to take my word for it. The records themselves prove this cold-blooded calculation. Let us look at the meticulous admission logs kept by the Protestant Orphan Asylum of St. Louis between the years 1847 and 1869. Researchers went through those ledgers, line by line, documenting every single family situation. What they found is chilling. Only 27% of the children were actual orphans, with both parents dead. 4% had both parents alive. And a staggering 69%, more than 2 out of 3 children, had one parent still living. These parents walked through those doors and surrendered their children expecting compassion. They worked tirelessly, saving every penny to rebuild their lives and reclaim their families. But when they finally returned to the asylum to bring their children home, the beds were empty. The institutions told them that their children had been moved, placed out, or simply relocated. They were given no addresses, no forwarding information, and no way to trace their own flesh and blood. The children had vanished into an industrial machine that consumed them for profit. The charity was not a safety net. It was a processing plant designed to separate the vulnerable from their families permanently. The system intentionally silenced the cries of the mothers and erased the identities of the children. The architecture of this erasure was not a flaw in the system. It was the primary feature. Parents spent the rest of their lives searching for children who had been completely absorbed into a legal matrix of manipulation. This was the first step in a much larger, much more sinister operation. Because the asylums were rapidly running out of space to warehouse all this stolen human capital, they needed a distribution network, and they built one that would change the face of the American West forever. Enter Charles Loring Brace, a man history remembers as a great philanthropist, the founder of the Children's Aid Society in 1853. But when you look closely at the machinery he built, Brace looks less like a savior and more like a visionary human trafficker. He understood a fundamental economic reality of the 19th century. The American West was expanding at an explosive rate. Farms in Illinois, Iowa, and across the Midwest were desperate for labor. They needed strong hands to clear fields, pick crops, and build a booming agricultural empire. But adult workers demanded wages, and they could strike. Where could this expanding empire find an endless supply of free, obedient labor that could not fight back? The answer was sitting in the overcrowded orphan asylums of the eastern cities. Brace engineered a solution that he called the placing out system, but today we know it by a much more innocent-sounding name, the orphan trains. Between the years 1854 and 1929, an estimated 150,000 children were loaded onto trains heading west. Try to visualize this terrifying reality. Trains filled with confused, crying children, rolling into small rural towns. When the train stopped, the children were paraded onto a local stage, or the platform of a train station. Local farmers and townspeople would gather around to inspect them. They were not looking for a son or a daughter to love. They were shopping for farm equipment. The farmers would check the children's teeth to gauge their health and age. They would squeeze their biceps and pinch their legs to test their strength. It was a livestock auction disguised as a rescue mission. Brothers and sisters who clung to each other on the train were frequently ripped apart on that platform, selected by different farmers, and taken to towns miles away from each other, never to speak again. But how did the institutions make this legal? Through a sinister legal instrument known as indenture papers. When a farmer selected a child, he signed a legally binding contract. Boys were bound to unpaid hard labor until the age of 21. Girls were bound until the age of 18, often forced into grueling domestic servitude. The Illinois state legislature even passed a special act in 1861, making these specific orphanage indentures absolutely ironclad. These papers were the ultimate gag order. They completely severed the child from their past. In many cases, the children were given entirely new names by their new masters. Their old identities were erased from the official ledgers. If their biological parents back in New York or Boston finally scraped together enough money and came looking for them, they would find nothing. The institutions deliberately withheld the destination of the children. They never contacted the parents for permission. They permanently redistributed living, breathing children as agricultural labor. The charity was just the front door of a blood-soaked supply chain. And the most horrifying part is that this perfect system of exploitation was about to be weaponized against every single vulnerable minority in the country. This perfect system of exploitation was too efficient to remain just a solution for the slums of New York. It quickly evolved into a weapon of mass cultural destruction used to erase entire communities. If you look closely at the records, you will see that this was never just about poverty. It was about control. Take the Jewish orphan asylum in Cleveland, which opened in 1868. By the 1890s, it housed around 500 children annually, almost all of them Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The institution was run by acculturated German Jews, whose explicit goal was to Americanize these children. They stripped away Yiddish. They restricted parental visits to just 2 months a year. They censored the children's mail. They explicitly trained the boys to be manual laborers rather than scholars. By 1906, they proudly reported that the intermarriage rates of their alumni were far higher than the community average. The institution actually measured its own success by how effectively it had destroyed the cultural identity of its inmates. And remember, the vast majority of these children had living parents who were simply deemed culturally unfit. But if you think that is dark, Look at what happened to black families after emancipation in 1865. When slavery legally ended, former slaveholders faced an immediate crisis. Their free labor force was gone. So, they found a legal loophole. Across Maryland and other border states, former owners petitioned orphan courts to declare newly freed black parents financially incapable of supporting their families. The courts agreed and systematically bound emancipated black children, some as young as 3 years old, back to the exact same people who had just owned them. They called it an apprenticeship. The children were forced to pick cotton and tobacco under the exact same brutal conditions as slavery. The parents had absolutely no legal power to stop it. One mother described being dragged to the courthouse and forced to remain silent while the judge handed her child back to her former master. This was not charity. This was slavery after slavery, and then the system reached its terrifying peak. The federal government watched how perfectly this legal erasure worked and unleashed it on Native American children. Starting in the 1870s, the government began removing Native children from their families and forcing them into distant boarding schools. The architect of this system, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, stated his philosophy with chilling clarity in 1892. He said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." At institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, children were beaten for speaking their native languages. Their traditional clothing was burned upon arrival. Their long hair was forcibly cut. They were assigned New English names. By 1900, over 20,000 Native children were trapped in this system. Congress even passed a law in 1891, forcing Native parents to surrender their children or lose their government food rations. These were not four separate historical tragedies. The Protestant orphanages taking Catholic immigrants, the Jewish asylums stripping Eastern European identity, the black apprenticeships restoring slave labor, and the Native American boarding schools destroying indigenous cultures were all four faces of the exact same machine. Take the child, erase the culture, reshape the identity, call it progress. The ultimate betrayal of this entire nightmare is that the people in charge knew exactly what they were doing, and they eventually admitted it. In January of 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt convened 215 people at the White House for the first ever conference on the care of dependent children. Social workers, judges, labor leaders, and civic reformers all gathered in Washington. The government experts sat in that room and reached a conclusion that should have ended the orphanage system overnight. They declared that, except in unusual circumstances, the home should not be broken up for reasons of poverty. Read that again. The federal government openly acknowledged that for over 50 years, the entire charitable system had been separating children from their families based on poverty alone. This conference eventually led to the creation of the Children's Bureau in 1912 and began the slow dismantling of institutional child labor. It sparked the widow's pension movement, which finally gave poor mothers a way to keep their children. But here is the horrifying plot twist. By the year 1909, over 150,000 children had already been placed on those trains. Their families had already been scattered across the continent. Their original identities had already been completely erased. The government acknowledged that the machine was broken, but they never acknowledged the catastrophic damage it caused to the victims. No apologies were given. No reparations were ever offered. No reunification efforts were funded by the state. No national registry was ever created to help these separated families find each other. The system was just quietly wound down over the following decades, and the children, already scattered, were left to figure out their own histories, entirely on their own. The buildings are mostly gone now, demolished, or converted into modern offices decades ago. The records that do survive are almost always sealed, closed to the public, because of their supposedly sensitive personal nature. The architects of this erasure made sure the evidence was buried with them, but the consequences of their actions are still living in the bloodlines of millions of Americans today. Your bloodline. If your family tree hits a sudden, inexplicable dead end around the year 1870, or 1880, or 1890, it might not be a gap in the historical record. It might be the exact place where the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Your ancestor might have been admitted under one name and placed out under another, sent to a state where absolutely no one knew their family. Given indenture papers that replaced their identity with an agricultural contract. The last name you carry today, the name you pass down to your own children, might actually belong to a farmer in Illinois who bought your great-grandfather for the price of a train ticket. The connection to your real heritage was severed on purpose, not by fire, not by accident, but by corporate policy disguised as Christian charity. So, I have to ask you, if the orphanage system of the 19th century was actually a government-sanctioned human trafficking ring, what makes us think the charity industrial complex of today is any different? Who were the 90% of parents who lost their children? And what happened to the families who spent the rest of their lives waiting for sons and daughters who never came home? Check your own family history. Look at the empty spaces and tell me what you see. Do you think the era of erasing children is truly over? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because the truth is still out there, waiting to be found.